My brother-in-law forgot to invite me to 15 family events. I made him forget he ever had status. Trevor Blackwood was a cardiovascular surgeon who earned $520,000 annually at County Memorial Hospital, drove a Range Rover with vanity plates reading Heart Doc, and belonged to 3 exclusive social clubs that required references from existing members and annual dues exceeding $15,000. He'd been married to my wife's older sister, Caroline, for 9 years when I married Amanda in the summer of 2016, and he made his opinion of me clear within the first month. I worked as an insurance fraud investigator for the State Division of Insurance, making $71,000 reviewing suspicious medical claims and provider billing patterns. Trevor found this amusing in a way that he expressed through deliberate omission rather than direct insult. He'd invite everyone in Amanda's family to dinner parties at his waterfront estate except us, claiming he'd simply forgotten to add our names to the guest list. He'd organize golf outings with Amanda's father and brothers without mentioning them to me until afterward, acting surprised when Amanda expressed frustration at being excluded. The pattern established itself quickly and remained consistent for 8 years. Family birthday celebrations happened at Trevor's house or at restaurants he selected, and our invitations would arrive 3 days late or not at all, forcing Amanda to hear about events from her mother after they'd already occurred. Holiday gatherings were scheduled through group text chains that somehow never included my number, despite Trevor claiming he'd added everyone. Summer vacations to Trevor's lake house happened with careful coordination of dates and logistics that excluded us until the day before departure, when Trevor would apologize profusely and say the guest house was already full with Caroline's parents and siblings. No room remained for us, unfortunately. Amanda would stand in our kitchen holding her phone, reading texts from her mother describing activities we weren't invited to participate in, and I'd watch her face crumple with hurt she tried to hide from me because defending her marriage meant acknowledging her family treated us as second-tier relations. Trevor's social circle reinforced his assessment of my professional inadequacy at every opportunity. His closest friends included 2 other surgeons, a corporate attorney who specialized in mergers and acquisitions, and a real estate developer who'd built half the luxury housing in our county. They'd gather at Trevor's house for scotch tastings and poker nights that he'd mention casually to Amanda's brothers while I was present, making sure I understood I wasn't welcome among men who dealt in serious money and serious professional stakes. When forced social interactions occurred at large family gatherings Trevor couldn't reasonably exclude us from, he'd introduce me to his friends as Amanda's husband who worked for the state, emphasis on the word state delivered with subtle disdain that suggested government employment ranked slightly above unemployment in his hierarchy of respectable careers. His friends would nod politely and redirect conversation to topics I couldn't contribute to meaningfully. Discussions of surgical techniques and real estate portfolios and legal strategies for minimizing corporate tax exposure. Amanda's mother, Diane, enabled Trevor's behavior through enthusiastic participation in his social events and consistent failure to acknowledge our exclusion. She'd call Amanda the day after dinner parties at Trevor's house, describing the catered meal and the interesting guests and the lovely conversation, seemingly oblivious to the fact that her younger daughter hadn't been invited. When Amanda would point out the pattern gently, suggesting maybe Trevor could be more careful about including everyone, Diane would make excuses about Trevor being busy with his surgical schedule and how difficult it must be to coordinate guest lists when you're hosting constantly. The subtext was clear. Trevor's house was the family's primary social venue because he had the money and status to host properly, and if we wanted to be included, we should be grateful for whatever access we received rather than complaining about being excluded. Amanda's father, Richard, took a more passive approach, attending Trevor's events without comment and never advocating for our inclusion when plans were being made. The most painful exclusions involved Amanda's nieces and nephews, Caroline's 3 children who Trevor ensured grew up barely knowing their aunt. Birthday parties for the kids happened at elaborate venues Trevor rented, bounce house facilities and skating rinks, and once an entire trampoline park, and our invitations would arrive after the parties had already occurred. Amanda would receive photos through family group chats, showing her parents and siblings celebrating with the children, while we sat at home unaware the events were happening. She'd call Caroline asking why we hadn't been told, and Caroline would claim she'd assumed Trevor had handled invitations, that it must have been an oversight. So sorry you missed it. This happened for every birthday, every school performance, every soccer game and dance recital that Trevor organized viewing parties for at his house. Amanda's relationship with her nieces and nephews became distant and strained because we were systematically excluded from the regular contact that builds familial bonds, and Caroline seemed content with this arrangement because it positioned her family as the primary branch while we remained peripheral. The 15th exclusion happened in October 2023 and marked a turning point in how I thought about Trevor's behavior. Amanda's grandmother, Margaret, turned 90 years old, and the family planned a surprise party at an upscale restaurant with private dining rooms. Trevor handled all arrangements because he had connections to the restaurant owner through his social clubs and could secure the best room. The party was scheduled for Saturday evening at 7 o'clock, and we learned about it Sunday morning when Diane called Amanda to say what a wonderful celebration it had been, how Margaret had cried when everyone jumped out to surprise her, how the food was exceptional, and the speeches were so moving. Amanda held the phone away from her ear and stared at me with an expression of such profound hurt that I felt rage replace the resigned acceptance I'd developed over years of exclusions. This wasn't forgetting to add names to casual dinner party lists. This was deliberately excluding us from a milestone celebration for Amanda's grandmother, a woman who'd helped raise her and who Amanda spoke with weekly, and the cruelty was so blatant and undeniable that even Diane's excuses sounded hollow when she tried to claim Trevor must have forgotten. I told Amanda I was done accepting Trevor's treatment as though it were accidental oversight rather than calculated exclusion designed to establish social hierarchy. She looked at me with exhausted agreement and said she'd been done for years, but didn't know what we could do about it since her entire family enabled Trevor's behavior by participating in his events and accepting his explanations without demanding he treat us with basic consideration. I said I'd figure something out, that Trevor's status and wealth had insulated him from consequences, but everyone had vulnerabilities if you looked hard enough. Amanda asked what I meant, and I told her my job investigating insurance fraud gave me access to claims databases and provider billing records across the state system. I said I'd look into Trevor's practice patterns just to see if anything seemed irregular, purely informational review without any predetermined agenda. Amanda went very still and asked if that was ethical, given the personal connection. I said discovering fraud was literally my job description, and that family relationships didn't create exemptions for providers who submitted false claims. I started reviewing Trevor's billing records the following Monday morning using database access I had for legitimate investigative purposes. The system tracked all medical procedures billed to state insurance programs, including Medicaid and the state employee health plan, with details about procedure codes, diagnosis codes, provider information, and payment amounts. Trevor performed cardiovascular surgeries at County Memorial Hospital and billed both insurance companies and government programs for his services. I pulled 5 years of his billing history and started analyzing patterns using software designed to identify statistical anomalies that suggested fraud or abuse. The initial analysis took 3 days and revealed concerning patterns in Trevor's coding practices. He was billing for complex surgical procedures at rates significantly higher than peer surgeons in the same specialty and geographic region. This alone didn't prove fraud, as some surgeons genuinely performed more complex cases, but it warranted deeper investigation into whether the procedure codes matched actual services rendered. I requested operative notes and medical records for 30 randomly selected cases where Trevor had billed for the highest-level cardiovascular procedures. This required formal request through our division's medical records unit, which meant the investigation was now documented and official rather than casual database review. My supervisor, a woman named Rita Alvarez, who'd investigated medical fraud for 15 years, called me into her office to discuss the case. She asked why I'd selected Trevor Blackwood as an investigation target, and I told her about statistical anomalies in his billing patterns without mentioning the family connection initially. She pulled up his billing summary on her computer and nodded slowly, agreeing the patterns looked suspicious enough to warrant case-level review. Then she asked directly if I had any personal connection to this provider that could compromise investigative objectivity. I told her Trevor was married to my wife's sister and that he'd systematically excluded us from family events for 8 years while maintaining his position as the family's social leader through wealth and status derived partly from the medical billing I was investigating. Rita leaned back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. She said personal connections to investigation targets created serious problems if they compromised objectivity or if they created appearance of retaliation rather than legitimate fraud investigation. I told her the statistical anomalies would exist regardless of who reviewed them, that Trevor's billing patterns warranted investigation based purely on objective metrics. She asked if I could maintain professional detachment if the investigation revealed serious fraud that would destroy Trevor's medical career and likely his social status and marriage. I said yes without hesitation, because the alternative was admitting years of exclusion had compromised my professional judgment to the point where I couldn't be trusted to investigate legitimate fraud. Rita nodded and assigned a senior investigator named James Burton to co-review all my findings and co-sign major investigative decisions. This created accountability and institutional backing while allowing me to proceed with the investigation that would either confirm or disprove my suspicions about Trevor's billing practices. The medical records arrived 2 weeks later, and I spent a month reviewing operative notes against billed procedure codes. The discrepancies were systematic and significant. Trevor routinely billed for the most complex level of cardiovascular procedures, while operative notes described relatively routine surgeries that should have been coded at lower reimbursement levels. In one case, he'd billed $43,000 for a complex coronary artery bypass with multiple grafts, while the operative notes described a straightforward 2-vessel bypass that standard coding guidelines priced at $28,000. He'd done this repeatedly across dozens of cases, systematically upcoding procedures to maximize reimbursement from insurance programs that paid based on reported complexity. More concerning, several cases showed Trevor billing for surgical procedures he'd never actually performed, claiming reimbursement for follow-up surgeries that operative notes didn't document and that patient records suggested never occurred. I documented 15 cases with clear evidence of upcoding where procedure codes didn't match operative note descriptions, and 7 cases with evidence of phantom billing where claimed procedures weren't documented in medical records. James reviewed my analysis carefully and confirmed the discrepancies were significant and indicated likely fraud rather than innocent coding errors. We calculated that Trevor had improperly billed state insurance programs approximately $340,000 over 5 years through these fraudulent practices. Rita reviewed our joint findings and authorized expanding the investigation to interview patients and request additional records from County Memorial Hospital regarding Trevor's surgical practice. This meant the investigation was moving from preliminary review to formal enforcement consideration, and that Trevor would eventually be notified he was under investigation for medical fraud. I felt my stomach tighten, knowing this would create the very confrontation I'd been building toward since Margaret's 90th birthday party. The patient interviews revealed troubling patterns beyond the billing fraud. We contacted 12 patients whose records showed discrepancies between billed procedures and documented services, and 8 agreed to speak with us. Several described post-operative complications Trevor had minimized or dismissed when they'd sought follow-up care. One woman, Nancy Thornton, described developing persistent chest pain after a procedure Trevor claimed was routine, and when she'd returned to his office expressing concerns, Trevor had told her the pain was psychosomatic and suggested she see a therapist rather than pursuing additional cardiac evaluation. Nancy had eventually gone to another cardiologist who discovered Trevor had nicked an artery during surgery, causing restricted blood flow that required corrective procedure. Trevor's operative notes made no mention of the arterial damage, suggesting he'd either not noticed the complication or had deliberately failed to document it to avoid malpractice scrutiny. Nancy's subsequent surgery cost an additional $31,000 and weeks of recovery time that Trevor's negligence had caused. I compiled witness statements and medical evidence into a comprehensive investigative report that documented systematic billing fraud and potential medical negligence that fell outside our division's direct jurisdiction but warranted referral to the state medical board. James co-signed every finding and conclusion, ensuring the investigation met institutional standards regardless of my personal connection to the subject. Rita reviewed the complete package and scheduled a meeting with our division director and the state attorney general's office to discuss potential criminal charges in addition to civil penalties for fraud against state insurance programs. This was the moment when the investigation stopped being about statistical anomalies and became about Trevor facing felony charges that would end his medical career, strip his surgical privileges, and likely result in prison time if prosecutors pursued maximum penalties. I thought about Amanda sitting at home unaware that I was building a case that would destroy her sister's husband and fracture her family more completely than years of deliberate exclusion had. The state attorney general's office assigned a prosecutor named David Wu to review potential criminal charges. David spent 3 weeks analyzing evidence before requesting a meeting with Rita, James, and me to discuss the case. He arrived at our office carrying boxes of medical records and billing documents we'd provided. And he spent 90 minutes asking detailed questions about coding practices, standard of care issues, and the strength of evidence connecting Trevor to fraudulent billing decisions. David said the upcoding cases were strong because operative notes clearly contradicted billed procedure codes in ways that showed pattern rather than occasional error. The phantom billing cases were even stronger because they showed Trevor claiming payment for procedures that simply never occurred, which constituted straightforward fraud with minimal defense options. The medical negligence issues were more complicated because they fell under medical board jurisdiction rather than criminal prosecution, but they'd provide additional context if the case went to trial, showing Trevor's general disregard for proper medical practice. David said he wanted to pursue felony fraud charges carrying potential prison sentences of 3 to 5 years, along with restitution requirements that would force Trevor to repay the $340,000 improperly billed plus penalties and interest. He also wanted to coordinate with the state medical board to pursue simultaneous action revoking Trevor's medical license permanently. This approach would hit Trevor on multiple fronts: criminal prosecution and professional license revocation, and civil penalties from insurance programs seeking compensation. David asked if I understood that pursuing these charges would create massive family conflict for my wife, given Trevor's marriage to her sister. I said yes, I understood completely. But that fraud was fraud regardless of family relationships, and that victims like Nancy Thornton deserved justice for Trevor's negligence and financial crimes. David nodded and said he'd draft criminal charges for filing within 60 days after giving Trevor notice and opportunity to respond to preliminary findings. I told Amanda about the investigation that evening while we ate dinner at our small kitchen table. She set down her fork and stared at me in silence for a long moment. Then she asked how long the investigation had been ongoing. I told her since November, which meant 3 months of conducting a criminal fraud investigation against her brother-in-law while attending Christmas dinner with her family and pretending everything was normal. She asked if I'd pursued this investigation because of the exclusions or because I'd found legitimate evidence of fraud. I told her honestly that the exclusions had motivated me to look at Trevor's billing records initially, but that the evidence of fraud was objective and would warrant prosecution regardless of who discovered it. James had verified every finding. Rita had supervised major decisions. David was pursuing criminal charges based on strength of evidence rather than my personal recommendations. This wasn't vendetta disguised as investigation. This was legitimate fraud prosecution that happened to target someone who'd treated us terribly for years. Amanda stood up and walked to the window, looking out at our small backyard. She said prosecuting Trevor would destroy Caroline's life, would turn her entire family against us, would end any possibility of reconciliation or normal family relationships. I said Trevor had destroyed those relationships already through 8 years of systematic exclusion, that we'd been treated as second-tier family members, not worthy of inclusion in normal gatherings and celebrations, and that now Trevor would face consequences for crimes he'd committed that had nothing to do with how he'd treated us personally. Amanda turned around and her eyes were filled with tears. She said she believed me that the evidence was legitimate, but she also knew everyone would interpret this as retaliation, regardless of objective merits. She asked if I'd considered what this would cost her emotionally and relationally, whether destroying Trevor's career was worth losing her relationship with her sister and parents and nieces and nephews permanently. I told her I'd considered it extensively, that I'd struggled with exactly those questions throughout the investigation, but that allowing Trevor to continue committing fraud because prosecuting him was personally inconvenient meant prioritizing our family comfort over protection of vulnerable patients and insurance programs. Nancy Thornton had suffered cardiac complications that Trevor ignored because acknowledging them would expose his surgical negligence. Other patients had paid higher insurance premiums because Trevor's fraudulent billing inflated program costs across the system. The crimes were real, and the victims were real, and they deserved justice regardless of family implications. Amanda nodded slowly and said she understood my reasoning, but that understanding didn't make the coming destruction any easier to accept. She asked if there was any way to pursue penalties against Trevor without criminal prosecution, maybe civil fines or probation, that would punish the fraud without destroying his career completely. I said David Wu had considered that option and rejected it because the evidence supported felony charges and because allowing wealthy professionals to buy their way out of consequences with civil penalties created a two-tier justice system that was fundamentally corrupt. The notice letter went to Trevor's attorney in February 2024, informing him of pending criminal fraud charges and medical board action. The letter outlined 15 specific instances of upcoding, 7 instances of phantom billing, and documented evidence of medical negligence in Nancy Thornton's case. Trevor had 30 days to respond before formal charges would be filed publicly. His attorney, a criminal defense lawyer named Gregory Nash, who specialized in white-collar crime, called David Wu requesting a meeting to discuss potential settlement. David agreed to meet, but made clear the state's position that Trevor's systematic fraud over 5 years warranted criminal prosecution rather than civil settlement. The meeting was scheduled for March 15th at the Attorney General's office, and David invited me to attend as the lead investigator who'd developed the case. I sat in the conference room with David, Rita, and James, while Gregory Nash arrived with Trevor and another attorney who specialized in medical licensing defense. This was my first time seeing Trevor since the investigation had become official, and he looked different than I remembered from family gatherings. His usual confident bearing had been replaced by visible stress, his face drawn and his movements careful, like someone navigating dangerous terrain. He didn't look at me directly when we entered the room, keeping his eyes on his attorneys or on the table in front of him. Gregory started by arguing that the alleged upcoding was based on legitimate differences in interpretation of procedure complexity, that cardiovascular surgery involved nuanced clinical judgment that couldn't be reduced to simple coding rules. David listened patiently and then asked Gregory to explain how operative notes describing routine 2-vessel bypass procedures could legitimately be coded as complex multi-vessel grafts requiring significantly higher reimbursement. Gregory said surgical complexity involved factors beyond vessel count, including patient risk profiles and technical difficulties that operative notes didn't always capture fully. David pulled out Nancy Thornton's medical records and asked Gregory to explain how billing for a follow-up procedure that never occurred could be interpreted as legitimate coding difference rather than straightforward fraud. The room went quiet. Gregory shuffled through papers in front of him and said there might have been documentation errors where procedures were billed, but operative notes weren't properly recorded. David asked if documentation errors that coincidentally always favored higher reimbursement occurred with enough frequency to explain 7 separate instances over 3 years. Trevor finally spoke, his voice tight and defensive, saying that billing departments handled coding and submission while he focused on patient care, and that any errors were administrative rather than fraudulent intent. David asked if Trevor reviewed billing statements before they were submitted to insurance programs. Trevor said yes, he reviewed them quarterly for accuracy. David said that quarterly review meant Trevor had personal knowledge of codes being submitted and chose not to correct discrepancies that inflated his reimbursement by hundreds of thousands of dollars. The meeting deteriorated from there into increasingly hostile exchanges between David and Trevor's attorneys about evidence strength and prosecutorial discretion and appropriate penalties. Gregory offered a settlement where Trevor would pay a $150,000 restitution and accept probation without admission of criminal wrongdoing. David countered that the state's position remained criminal prosecution, license revocation, and full restitution of $340,000 plus penalties. Gregory said those terms were unacceptable and would force them to contest charges at trial. David said that was Trevor's right, but that going to trial would make all evidence public, including witness testimony from patients like Nancy Thornton describing Trevor's negligent care and dismissal of serious complications. Trevor's face went pale, and I saw him grip the table edge hard enough that his knuckles turned white. Gregory requested a recess to consult with his client privately. David agreed, and we left the conference room for 20 minutes while Trevor and his attorneys discussed their options. When we returned, Gregory presented a revised offer. Trevor would plead guilty to 1 count of healthcare fraud, pay full restitution of $340,000, surrender his medical license voluntarily, and accept 5 years probation. In exchange, the state would recommend no prison time, and would not pursue additional charges related to the other 14 instances of documented fraud. David looked at Rita and me for input. Rita said the offer represented meaningful accountability, including license surrender, that would end Trevor's medical career permanently. I said the financial restitution would compensate defrauded programs appropriately, and the guilty plea would establish criminal record that would prevent Trevor from working in healthcare going forward. David told Gregory the state would accept those terms with one additional requirement. Trevor had to provide written apology to Nancy Thornton, acknowledging his negligent care and the complications she suffered as a result. Gregory started to object, but Trevor interrupted, saying he'd write the apology. We drafted settlement terms on the spot, and everyone signed. Trevor walked out of the Attorney General's office, having agreed to surrender the medical career and professional status he'd built his identity around for 15 years. I drove home knowing I'd destroyed Trevor's life in ways that would ripple through Amanda's family permanently and irrevocably. I found her sitting on the couch waiting for me, and I told her about the settlement terms before news reached her family through other channels. She listened without expression and then asked when Trevor would have to surrender his medical license. I said within 60 days, as part of the plea agreement. She asked when the guilty plea would become public record. I said within a week when court processed the paperwork. She said Caroline called her that afternoon crying, saying Trevor was facing criminal charges for billing fraud and that their family was about to lose everything they'd built. Amanda said Caroline had screamed at her asking why I'd pursued these charges. Whether I was happy now that I'd destroyed their lives, whether ruining Trevor professionally was worth the satisfaction of revenge for years of social exclusion. Amanda told Caroline the fraud was real and documented, and that victims deserved justice, but Caroline had hung up on her mid-sentence. The guilty plea became public record on March 22, 2024, when local media ran stories about prominent cardiovascular surgeon pleading guilty to healthcare fraud and surrendering his medical license. The articles included details about $340,000 in fraudulent billing and patient testimony about negligent care. Trevor's name appeared in headlines alongside words like fraud and deception and criminal conduct. I watched the stories spread through social media and local news broadcasts. Knowing Trevor's reputation was being destroyed in real time, as friends and colleagues and patients learned he'd systematically defrauded insurance programs while providing substandard care. Amanda received text messages from her mother demanding we come to her parents' house immediately to discuss the situation. We drove there in silence, both knowing this confrontation would determine whether any family relationship survived what I'd done to Trevor professionally. Diane and Richard sat in their living room with faces set in expressions of controlled anger and profound disappointment. Caroline was there with her 3 children, who'd been crying recently based on red eyes and tear-stained faces. Trevor wasn't present, presumably unable to face this particular family gathering after years of orchestrating them. Diane started talking before we'd even sat down, her voice shaking with fury, barely contained. She said I'd destroyed Caroline's family out of petty revenge for social exclusions that were honestly understandable, given the difference between Trevor's professional accomplishments and my modest government job. She said Trevor had worked for 15 years building his surgical practice and his reputation, and I'd ruined everything in 3 months of vindictive investigation driven by jealousy and inadequacy. She asked if I was satisfied now that Trevor couldn't practice medicine anymore, couldn't support his family, couldn't maintain the lifestyle Caroline and the children had built their expectations around. Richard was quieter but no less condemning. He said he'd always known I resented Trevor's success, that it was obvious at family gatherings how uncomfortable I was around accomplished men discussing real professional stakes and substantial money. He said, rather than working to improve my own career and social standing, I'd torn down someone who'd achieved what I couldn't reach myself. He said the fraud charges were technical violations that every medical practice dealt with to some degree, that billing complexity in healthcare created inevitable coding disputes that I'd weaponized into criminal charges because I had government authority and personal grievance. He said Trevor had made mistakes in billing practices but didn't deserve career destruction and public humiliation because of what were essentially administrative errors. He looked at Amanda and said he'd raised her to value family loyalty above petty resentments, and he was profoundly disappointed she'd stood by while I destroyed her sister's husband, and by extension, her sister's entire life. I let them finish before responding, keeping my voice level and factual rather than defensive or angry. I said Trevor had systematically defrauded state insurance programs for 5 years, stealing $340,000 through fraudulent billing practices that inflated costs for all program participants. I said Trevor had provided negligent care to patients like Nancy Thornton, dismissing serious post-surgical complications and creating additional medical problems that required corrective procedures. I said these weren't technical billing disputes or administrative errors, but deliberate fraud that Trevor reviewed and approved quarterly while knowing the codes didn't match actual services rendered. I said the investigation was supervised and verified by multiple colleagues, that the state attorney general had reviewed evidence independently before deciding to prosecute, that this wasn't personal vendetta, but institutional response to serious crimes that happened to involve someone who'd treated us terribly for years. Caroline stood up screaming that I was self-righteous and vindictive, that I'd hidden behind professional obligations to destroy her husband because he'd never respected me or my inadequate career. She said Trevor had tried to maintain family boundaries that reflected natural social hierarchies, that successful people naturally gravitated toward other successful people, and that feeling excluded from that circle didn't justify destroying everything Trevor had built. She said her children were losing their father's income, and their house, and their school, and their social circle, because I couldn't handle not being invited to dinner parties and golf outings. She said Amanda should be ashamed of staying married to someone who'd weaponized government authority against family members, and that Caroline would never forgive either of us for what we'd done. She grabbed her children's hands and walked out of the house, slamming the door hard enough that the windows rattled. Diane and Richard stared at us with expressions of such complete disappointment and rejection that I felt physically sick, despite believing my investigation was justified. We left without further conversation because nothing we said would change their assessment that I'd committed unforgivable betrayal by investigating legitimate fraud that destroyed Trevor's status. Amanda cried on the drive home, not the quiet tears I'd seen before, but deep sobs that shook her shoulders and made breathing difficult. She said Caroline was right that this would cost her relationship with her sister permanently, that her nieces and nephews would grow up being told their Aunt Amanda's husband destroyed their father's career, that every future family interaction would carry the weight of this conflict. I told her I was sorry the investigation had created this situation, but that the alternative was allowing Trevor to continue defrauding insurance programs and providing negligent care to vulnerable patients. She said she understood intellectually, but emotionally, she felt destroyed by having to choose between her marriage and her family of origin, and that no amount of Trevor's fraud changed the fact that this choice would define the rest of her life. Trevor and Caroline's house went on the market in April 2024, a $2.1 million waterfront property they could no longer afford without Trevor's surgical income. His guilty plea made him unemployable in healthcare, and the restitution payments of $340,000 plus legal fees had depleted their savings. Caroline returned to work as a pharmaceutical sales representative, a job she'd left when Trevor's income made her employment unnecessary. The children transferred to public schools from private academies that cost $30,000 annually per child. Trevor took a job with a medical consulting firm reviewing insurance claims for proper coding, ironic employment, given his guilty plea for fraudulent billing practices. The consulting work paid approximately $85,000 annually, a fraction of his surgical income, and barely enough to cover basic expenses without the luxury lifestyle they'd built. I knew these details because Amanda's mother called her occasionally to describe Caroline's struggles in detail. Making sure we understood the consequences of my investigation had destroyed an entire family's financial security and social standing. Amanda stopped receiving invitations to any family events after March 2024. Her parents made clear we weren't welcome at gatherings where Caroline would be present, which meant effectively all family occasions, since Caroline naturally took priority as the daughter whose husband I'd destroyed. Amanda's nieces and nephews had birthdays that happened without our knowledge or participation. Family holidays occurred at Diane and Richard's house with celebration photos posted to social media showing everyone except us. The systematic exclusion we'd experienced for 8 years during Trevor's social dominance had reversed completely, but instead of Trevor engineering our absence, Caroline demanded it, and Diane and Richard complied. Amanda scrolled through the photos on her phone, looking at images of family gatherings she wasn't part of anymore, and I'd watch her face show the same hurt I'd seen for years when Trevor's exclusions had isolated us from family connection. The difference now was that everyone blamed me directly for the exclusion rather than pretending it was oversight or complicated logistics. In July 2024, 4 months after Trevor's guilty plea, I received a letter at my office from Nancy Thornton thanking me for investigating the fraud and getting Trevor held accountable. She wrote that she'd struggled emotionally after discovering Trevor's negligence had caused complications requiring additional surgery, and that knowing his fraudulent practices had been exposed and punished helped her find some closure. She said she'd filed a medical malpractice lawsuit against Trevor and County Memorial Hospital, seeking compensation for her additional medical costs and suffering. Her attorney had used Trevor's guilty plea as evidence of his general pattern of dishonest conduct and disregard for proper medical practice. The hospital had settled her claim quickly for $400,000 rather than face trial, where Trevor's criminal fraud would become central evidence. Nancy wrote that the settlement didn't erase what happened to her, but provided financial compensation and validation that what Trevor did to her was wrong and not her imagination or anxiety as he'd claimed. I kept Nancy's letter in my desk drawer and read it occasionally when doubts crept in about whether destroying Trevor's career had been worth the cost to Amanda's family relationships. The letter reminded me that beyond family drama and social exclusions were real victims who'd been harmed by Trevor's fraud and negligence. Nancy deserved justice and protection from medical professionals who treated patients as revenue sources rather than human beings requiring careful treatment. The enforcement action hadn't made me popular with Amanda's family or resolved the complicated emotions around watching someone's life collapse, but it had served institutional purposes of punishing serious crimes and compensating victims. That was supposed to be enough justification, and professionally it was, but personally, it felt inadequate against the weight of Amanda's grief about losing her family connection permanently. Trevor's social status collapsed completely in the months following his guilty plea. His memberships at exclusive clubs were revoked when his criminal record became public. The friends who'd gathered at his house for scotch tastings and poker nights stopped returning his calls after news stories described his healthcare fraud. County Memorial Hospital removed his name from the cardiac surgery wing he'd helped fundraise for years earlier, unwilling to maintain association with physician convicted of criminal fraud. The Range Rover with Heart Doc vanity plates was repossessed when Trevor couldn't maintain payments on his consulting income. Caroline's social circle, built largely through connections to Trevor's wealthy colleagues, dissolved as surgeons' wives and professional families distanced themselves from association with criminal conviction and financial collapse. Trevor went from being the family's social center and status symbol to being someone whose name created awkward silences and conversation shifts at gatherings he no longer attended. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.